My guest today, Alex Rampell, general partner at the venture capital firm Andreessen Horowitz, is hoping for and has a reasonably decent chance of getting a 1,000 times multiple on his real estate investment. Whether he gets it or not, one thing is certain. When someone like Alex Rampell starts looking at what you are doing, you can be sure that your world is about to change. Welcome to the National Real Estate Forum podcast, episode 208. Thank you for joining me today. I am Dr. Adam Gower, and this is the Crowdfund Project at nreforum.org, where developers, investors, and industry leaders share insights that you can use to raise capital and invest in crowd-funded real estate deals. I have been working on an equity investment in a senior Silicon Valley. Deal size is $110 million, and with 40 or 45 million of equity already committed, the sponsor has asked me to help raise the remaining 5 million. Now, as a lifelong real estate professional, I have only ever before invested in deals that I own and control. But the more I look at this deal in Silicon Valley, 18% IRR, institutional caliber project, multi-family office sponsors, long-term passive income, the more I wonder why I even think about taking on all the liability and risk, signing on the debt, and developing on my own account. Why not diversify into other deals, apply my expertise to checking the sponsor's work product, and let someone else do all the work? What makes this option available to me and to you to invest in a deal of this size and quality is the marriage of finance and technology at the altar of new regulations. Simply stated, this Silicon Valley deal is possible because at the altar of new regulations. Simply stated, this Silicon Valley deal is possible because regulations have recently changed to allow this whole financial transaction to occur online, and technology has evolved to make all that possible. Before introducing Alex, I would like to thank Ariel Westberg of Engel & Volkers in Beverly Hills for her very kind words of appreciation for what she is learning through listening to these podcasts. As a special thank you, Ariel, please go to the nationalrealestateforum.org website, nreforum.org/primer, and use the code in all caps Ariel, A-R-I-E-L, to get a 30% discount off my online course, An Introduction to Crowdfunded Real Estate. In it, I give you background to the industry, some secret tips I usually only share with clients, and some guidance on how you can raise money and invest in crowdfunded real estate deals yourself. Thanks again, Ariel. I really appreciate your kind words. It is my great pleasure to introduce the only person you are ever likely to meet who is not only shooting for a 1,000 times multiple on his real estate investment, but based on his track record has a good chance of actually getting it. Alex Rampell, general partner at the venture capital fund Andreessen Horowitz, has founded and successfully exited multiple fintech companies and is an investor in several in the real estate space. He has invested in Pier Street, whose founder and CEO Brew Johnson was my guest last week. The very fact that a venture capitalist of Alex's caliber is interested in investing in real estate in this way is a clear indication that our industry is actively being targeted by folk who are very, very good at fundamentally changing the way people conduct business. And as he is now set upon radically disrupting the real estate status quo, hearing him talk about it today should prove useful to you in determining how to raise equity for your next deal, or that investing in somebody else's deal may just be an equally useful expense of your time and expertise.
Sure. So my name is Alex Rampell. I'm a general partner at Andreessen Horowitz. We are a venture capital firm based in Menlo Park, California. And I've been here for about 2 years. Before I joined the firm, I had been what people here call a serial entrepreneur. So I'd started a number of companies, primarily in the financial services space. So the last one that I started was called TrialPay, which was a payments company, and Visa, the credit card company, acquired TrialPay in 2015. And then after that acquisition, I joined here. And it started a couple other companies, primarily, as I mentioned, in financial services, one of which is called Affirm, which does point-of-sale lending. So it helps you finance and expense. And then the last one, which I helped start, is called Point, which does fractional equity ownership of homes. So kind of have always been fascinated with things around financial services, which is very odd because most people aren't fascinated with such things. And real estate obviously is a huge part of that, because even though real estate is not just a financial services play, but it is the largest asset class pretty much in the world. I mean, you have trillions and trillions of dollars of residential real estate, commercial real estate. How is it financed? How is it bought and sold? Just everything involving a transaction for real estate is subject to change, because the internet changed many industries. Like, think about how you bought an airline ticket 30 years ago or 40 years ago. The way that you would buy many different items before the internet is you would call a number, or you would go somewhere in person, you would talk to somebody that would then go interface with a mainframe computer and do something, or do a couple different things, and then a transaction would happen. And really, that intermediary person has in most industries been removed. So whereas before you used to have to go to a travel agent to go buy an airplane ticket, I mean, now you go to Kayak. And Kayak effectively provides that interface. Like, the internet often removes that one skip that would be involved in many transactions. So the internet means you go to Kayak. Kayak talks to what used to be Saver, like this old mainframe computer, and then lets you connect to an airplane company and then go buy your ticket. And the same thing is kind of happening for real estate as well. Although real estate is probably the hardest one to change, partially because the frequency of, at least for residential real estate, the frequency of purchase is so low. There's a saying that I'm fond of, which is, every industry is a conspiracy against the lady, which is, if you think about the taxi industry as an example, I would argue very strongly that Lyft and Uber have made the lives of most consumers much better, because, whereas before it would take you 45 minutes to get an old dirty taxi, it would be overpriced, and the driver would pretend not to know where they're going. Now you can get a Lyft in 2 minutes. It's cheaper, it's cleaner, you can provide real-time feedback. I mean, this is really, really good. And yet, when Lyft and Uber started, it was not without controversy. Like, the taxi companies really tried to put them out of business, which was obviously, that was in their favor. That was what I meant by conspiracy against the lady. Like, the taxi industry, the entrenched competition, did not want new technology-enabled competition to go spreading around. And the difference, though, between that and a real estate transaction for a consumer is that your average consumer might buy a house every 7 to 10 years. So, they care about it, and they want it to be a better experience. They want the fees to be lower. They want to understand, what is this title insurance thing that I'm being required to pay for, and, why do I need it? All of these things that go into it are done as frequently, where consumers are up in arms about getting better service or better functionality. And that's one of the reasons why, and also, if you look at the entrenched forces within real estate, there's this idea of concentrated benefit and diffuse harm. So if you say, okay, why is it that real estate fees, like commissions on residential real estate transactions, still are stable at between 5 and 6%? That seems odd when there's so much competition, when there's so many different technology platforms that would drive that potentially lower. But part of it is this idea of there's very, very concentrated benefit in terms of real estate agents who benefit from that fee enormously. I mean, that is their livelihood. And there's somewhat diffuse harm it depends on your vantage point, but diffuse harm in terms of consumers that would prefer not to pay that. But again, if it's a once every 10-year transaction and then once every 10-year fee, they don't actually care as much. So it's a little bit more, I wouldn't say it's immune to change, but it's harder to affect dynamics of kind of concentrated benefit, diffuse harm, and very episodic transactions as opposed to very high-frequency transactions.
Well, that's a very interesting perspective. And actually, that is a subject that I covered extensively in Series 1 in the podcast. And I actually had a conversation with Chad Severson, who is a professor at Chicago and partner of Steve Levitt of Freakonomics fame. And his theory is that one of the reasons that the real estate brokerage industry has not been disrupted yet is because you actually have to disrupt two intermediaries. You have to disrupt both the buy and the sell side agent. So if you have a selling agent who is discounting fees, the buying agent has an incentive to steer clients away to preserve their livelihood in the long term. There's all kinds of frictions in that industry, or at least in that side of the real estate industry. But a lot of the deals that you have described are in a field that is called fintech. And I know this is a relatively new term, probably newer, in fact, even than the Jobs Act. So perhaps you could tell me, what is fintech and what does it mean to the real estate industry? Or where have you seen it applied in the real estate industry?
Sure. Well, I mean, I'd say like the skeptical view of fintech would be that it's much more fin than tech. Like if you were to start a new bank today, you wouldn't call it a bank. You would call it, I started a fintech company. Well, what does your fintech company do? Well, we take deposits and we make loans, and we're calling ourselves a fintech company. Whereas if you're 150 years old and very profitable and have lots of branches, then you're just a bank. Now that's the cynical view of it. I would lots of branches, then you're just a bank. Now that's the cynical view of it. I would say that fintech in general is just technology-enabled businesses that are trying to do something in the realm of finance. I kind of define it across four different categories. The first is, relatively speaking, things that banks do. So banks, they take deposits, they make loans, and they send money. And there are some things like payments that are an amalgamation of those. The second category is a very broad range of things that banks don't do. So, think about payday loans or check cashing, or something like point, as I mentioned. Like banks don't allow you to sell part of the equity in your home. So it's kind of saying, all right, we have this thing called the internet where people can interface with each other in real time. We don't need branches. We don't need a lot of old-fashioned in-person communication. What types of businesses can we build because of that? And, think about, there's a whole realm of pay me in 45 days. Can somebody go and buy that receivable? And of course, everybody would want to buy a receivable from GE, but I'm based in Iowa, and how am I going to find somebody that will pay me the most money? Well, you build a marketplace around that. So there have been invoice factoring firms for 50, 100, probably 200 years, but what the internet has enabled is kind of making the world flat. Just like there might be a dating site where lots of people go to the dating site no matter where they live. eBay, created a marketplace for lots and lots of different things. A lot of fintech is creating a marketplace for all things around money. So like category 2, I would say, is things that banks don't do. Category 3 is insurance. So there are lots of new insurance companies that are kind of starting out very hard. I mean, insurance, you wouldn't necessarily call that a fintech company. You would call that an insurance company. But if you can do it with better underwriting data because everybody's wearing a Fitbit, or you can do it with better underwriting, very hard. I mean, insurance, you wouldn't necessarily call that a fintech company. You would call that an insurance company. But if you can do it with better underwriting data because everybody's wearing a Fitbit, or you can do it with better underwriting data for cars because you can measure on your cell phone how fast you're driving. And there's an argument to be made that it's much more around the technology than the financial service that's being provided. And the fourth category is just around investment management, so things like robo-advisors and whatnot. So that's kind of the broad way that we think about fintech. But in many respects, it's like the way that you would think about your fintech company in 20 years is you would think about it as your bank, you would think about it as your insurance company, you would think about it as your retirement account. You wouldn't necessarily think of it as a consumer, as your quote unquote fintech company.
Okay, and so that applies also to Point and Peer Street, does it? Because when I looked at those, it seems like those are technology-enabled investment platforms.
They're technology businesses at the core. So there's no branch, there's no retail establishment. It's a website where you go, and it's a marketplace where transactions happen. So it's kind of like eBay, but it's eBay not for Pez dispensers and rare postage stamps. It's eBay for, in the case of Peer Street, it's eBay for hard money loans, or in the case of Point, it's eBay for equity shares in residential real estate. So yes, that was the point that I was making about fintech, which is it's kind of a catch-all term where from the end user perspective or from the master of the field perspective, you would just kind of consider it what it is, which is, okay, Peer Street, that's a hard money lending site. Yes, I agree with that. Mm-hmm. The catch-all would be like we wouldn't call it an enterprise software company, or we wouldn't call it a router company. We would call it a fintech company, kind of in the realm of venture capital. Enterprise software company, or we wouldn't call it a router company. We would call it a fintech company, kind of in the realm of venture capital. Like that's the I mean, it's not a narrow vertical. It's actually quite a large vertical because financial services are, call it, 15% of GDP in the U.S. But all of these things fall under the fintech umbrella.
Be sure to listen to the end of this podcast for Alex's advice on how to succeed as he has done, and for advice he offers based on lessons he has learned.
So what was it about these two companies that appealed to you for investment?
Well, a lot of what you think about in venture capital is, is the team very, very good, and is the opportunity enormous? And both of these had that going for them, in my opinion. So if you think about something like Point, it's really rethinking this idea of how does resident estate work, and it doesn't make sense to only have two methods of kind of dwelling. The first method is called I'm renting, in which case I own 0% of my residence. The second is called owning, in which case I will eventually own 100% of my residence using a bank as a, call it, 30-year crutch to go acquire 100% of my residence. But why is that? Why is it that I have to have 100% of my property? Why can't I own 92% and sell the other 8% to somebody else? And going back to this eBay analogy, this actually happens quite often. So if you think about people that have wealthy parents, if they need to make a down payment on a home, in many cases, the person that helps them make that down payment is their wealthy parent or parents. Or actually, I have a friend who became very, very wealthy, and he had this old home that he had lived in for 30 years. He was moving to a much newer, nicer home, and he said, "Hey, I'll sell you 80% of the house, and I'll own 20% to make it easier for you to acquire this property." So this happens on and off, but there's never been a marketplace for this. In the same way that there were stamp trading groups well before eBay. So the idea was that this is a really, the time might be ripe for this, partially because home ownership is becoming much less accessible for people. And that if they don't have rich parents, how do they put 20% down? You don't want to replicate what happened in 07 and 08, or even a couple of years before there, of course, which was, let's forget about income requirements. Why are we requiring TV are 80%? Let's let it go to 95% or 98%. That's bad too. So this is, we just thought this was a much, much better idea for home ownership in a deleveraging way, as opposed to American. When they buy a house, it's 500% of their net worth or 400% of their net worth is effectively in their home. And a lot of debts that they incur, a lot of economic hardship that they go through is based on a somewhat antiquated or perhaps anachronistic, hopefully, notion that they either have to rent, or if they own, they have to own 100%. And yet at the same time, if you want something that will well index to inflation, particularly in what I would call supply-constrained markets, so the Bay Area is a supply-constrained market. Austin is now a supply-constrained market. Seattle is a supply-constrained market. Manhattan is a supply-constrained market. London is a supply-constrained market. When you have that going, again, this is not true forever. Detroit was once a supply-constrained market. But if you want, from an investment perspective, okay, I want to make sure that I have an economic instrument that protects me from inflation, that is a long. But if you want, from an investment perspective, okay, I want to make sure that I have an economic instrument that protects me from inflation, that is a long-term capital gain type play. Well, what would I want to do? I would want to own not one property in the Bay Area or in Seattle. I would want to own a basket of them. And that would be a very, very, if you were to buy a basket of San Francisco homes in the year 1998, that would have done very, very well. And it didn't matter which homes you were buying. The problem is that if you were to buy these homes individually, well, then you have to deal with tenants, you have to fix the toilets if they're broken, you have to pay real estate taxes and all things like that. Whereas what you want to do in order to play this trade, again, this is from the investor perspective and not from the homeowner perspective, but from the investor perspective, you don't want to deal with toilets, you don't want to deal with tenants, and you don't want to deal with taxes. You just want to have a play. The technology had kind of come a long way where you can do things like automated valuation models are not perfect, but they've gotten much better, as an example. the idea of placing a lien on a property, like how would you have done that 40 years ago versus today? Well, it's become much easier. So there are many, many different components where this business model suddenly made more sense because you could have done it 40 years ago. Like there's no reason why it wasn't accessible. And in fact, rich parents helped their kids acquire homes 40 years ago as well. So it was just more of there was a variety of components that suddenly became, not suddenly, but gradually became easier to do against an economic environment where homes were harder to acquire and this product was even more appealing to a large number of people.
Okay, so let's drill down on point because it's very interesting, some interesting observations you bring up. And aside from, of course, the big question, which is, at what point do you decide? And aside from, of course, the big question, which is, at what point do you decide, are you financing these down payments or these equity slugs in homes in a market that is close to saturation, right, or that is reaching its peak? And I think you could probably make that case. I mean, you're in the Bay Area. I've got a lot of experience in Beverly Hills and LA, and just seeing the way that pricing is skyrocketing. It's very compelling. Yes, I'll take a piece of equity in your house for the upside, but eventually the music stops, right? And it doesn't continue to go up. But taking it from a separate angle, how do you finance the loans or the equity slugs that you do give to homeowners? Are you using crowdfunded money for that, accredited investors, or is that all through the fund, through the venture capital funds?
Yeah, so right now, this is a good question for kind of the broader use case of fintech. So normally, a firm like ourselves, we buy equity in the company. So we are a venture capital firm, and we're looking for we're looking for the next Airbnb or the next Facebook or something where our equity might be worth thousands of times what we put in. And therefore, we're not buying the assets that these fintech firms originate, which is an important distinction. So because the assets that are originated, they look more like credit instruments that might yield 10 to 15%, or some cases even more. I mean, if you could get a 20% annual yield that's secured by a real asset, that's pretty compelling. Ironically, that's not very compelling for a venture capital firm because, our money comes from our, what we call LPs, our limited partners, and our limited partners already have exposure to corporate bonds or government debt or all sorts of other instruments that provide them with yield. They look at, I have a large endowment, I want to put 5% into venture capital where we're hopefully betting on these managers to yield every once in a while 1,000x return. So that's just kind of a high-level observation that I wanted to make. So consequently, for things like Point or things like Peer Street, we will arm them with the startup capital so they can actually get their business off the ground and build the operations and build, hire people, kind of build the core, and then they will raise their own money either in the form of, kind of crowdsourced deposits, if you will, accredited investors. I mean, in many cases, fintech companies have found it to be more productive to go raise money from very, very large institutions because even though it's much better to have 100,000 deposits of $1,000 each because then you have $100 million and then you have, 99,999 deposits. It's not really dependent on any one party. The problem is the acquisition costs. How do you get those 100,000 depositors for $1,000 each? Are you buying Google ads? Are you buying Facebook ads? The cost of acquiring that capital can be high, as opposed to if you have a very, very high-yielding instrument and you go to a hedge fund or you go to Goldman Sachs and say, hey, I'm originating 12-month loans that yield 12% on, real estate with a 60% loan to value, you're going to have a lot of people that really want that instrument, and you can probably get, with 2 phone calls, you can get $50 million from one person and $50 million from another institution. And that's actually a lot easier to do. It's less defensible. It's kind of more prone to ups and downs in the economy. This is why, why did Wells Fargo and Chase I mean, part of it, I mean, it's a very, very complicated reason for that, but they were too big to fail as one.
Yes.
But the reason why fundamentally is that, Wells Fargo and Chase both have over $1 trillion of core retail deposits, which is very, very sticky. Like that's the best capital that you can possibly get. So, but, you were asking about Point. I mean, Point right now is large accredited investors that say, hey, like the yields on this instrument are very good. It's asset backed, and I like the characteristics of it, so I want to go invest. And the same thing is true for Peer Street and almost all the other companies that we invest in. So it's typically getting accredited investors and/or institutions. Predominantly, I would say institutions for most of the companies that we work with, just because it's easier. I mean, in many cases, like the difference between a quote-unquote family office of a billionaire and an institution might actually mean that the accredited investor, like the family, the accredited investor, like the family office, can move much more quickly than the large institution. But in both cases, you're looking for a much, much larger check size from somebody that doesn't necessarily have what I would call redemption rights from their own limited partners. So, one of the challenges with longer dated assets is that you're a fintech company and you just got venture capital from somebody like us, and now you say, okay, I'm originating lots of assets. I need to raise hundreds of millions of dollars, and the term is going to be 3 years or 5 years. So it looks like a bond. I'm paying these coupons, and then everything, principal and interest, all gets repaid within 5 years. The hard thing about going to a hedge fund is that the hedge fund has itself raised money from limited partners, and some of them have the right to redeem that capital if they feel like it. It's a little bit more complicated than that. It depends on the terms of the investment that they made. So there's often a mismatch, whereas family offices, they don't have limited partners. It's just like a rich person. And the rich person often has a lot more flexibility to be in longer dated instruments than what a traditional hedge fund would be able to do. And then on the other side of this, it's like if you look at university endowments, if you look at sovereign wealth funds, if you look at insurance companies, so what do life insurance companies do with all the premiums that people pay them before they have to pay out the death benefit? Well, they go invest them. But it turns out that a lot of the places that they invested them for years, they're not very good yields anymore. Like, buying GE bonds used to be how MetLife made all their money, because GE bonds, they're AA rated and they yield 5 or 6. They used to yield 5 or 6%. Now they have the same rating, but they might yield 1 or 2%. So they're all very, very hungry for higher yield instruments that are still safe and secure. But they're typically not the first movers, because they want to see that this thing is real. Like, oh, should I go and buy something from a 2-year-old company? I don't know. They actually should if the underwriting is solid, but they're often laggards in terms of what they look to acquire. Like they want to just kind of buy. Like there's an adage in like buying IT equipment, which is a little bit of an anachronism itself, which is nobody gets fired for buying IBM. Like the equivalent in money management land is like nobody gets fired for buying GE bonds. So, the problem, GE bonds, like if you're a pension plan and you have to yield 7% every year to kind of fund your liabilities, like you're not hitting that target right now because of QE and where yields have gone across pretty much every asset class. And many of those people's perspective about the new fintech firms is that they are able to originate higher yield instruments, but at the same time, like, your average pension plan isn't signing up to go buy assets from a 3-month-old fintech company. So there still is that's what I was getting to, is that normally you start off with like accredited investors, kind of friends and family, family offices. They have the most flexibility, and then there's a whole stack of capital that you have to crawl to, where eventually the best buyers of this stuff are like insurance companies, pension plans, sovereign wealth funds, but they tend to be laggards in terms of what types of instruments they will and will not buy.
Alex discusses more companies than any other guest I've spoken to before, and I have included links to them all in the show notes to this episode. You can find them at nreforum.org/Alex. Link to the online real estate crowdfunding course that I mentioned to Ariel in the introduction.
Very interesting, yes, and that's because, they want to see tested platforms, right? I mean, like you say, it's the kind of the CYA approach to investing. You can't invest in somebody that hasn't, especially in real estate, I think, that hasn't gone through a cycle and survived out to the other side.
No, I was saying, I think that's actually what's interesting about a lot of the crowdfunding that's happening in real estate in general, which is, there's a phenomenon of kind of adverse selection in some cases, which is, I think all of this stuff is great. Like the idea of providing crowdfunding platforms is a terrific idea. The challenge is, how do you know, like there are some people that kind of can start a real estate project, can finish a real estate project, make all of their investors money. And again, like this is all subject to kind of the macroeconomic climate. And, when things like, you could have been the greatest real estate developer in the world in 2008, and you probably still would have lost money just because of the massive deflation that happened. So,
right.
But at the same time, like there are people that are very, very good. There are people that are not very good. And, the upshot of all the different crowdfunding platforms that are out there is that people that are good, that aren't experienced, but they actually are good, now they can actually get money to go build a project. The flip side of that, and this is what I would call the adverse selection, is that people that are not good can also get money to go fund a project.
Right.
And
yeah.
So the problem is that for the very, very first time person that's doing something, like how do you know which one they are? Are they good or are they bad? On the flip side, again, like going back to there's lots of capital chasing very little yield right now. In our industry of venture capital, like we have the same problem. Like, okay, here's a 23-year-old who's starting a company. Is that company going to succeed or fail? And we don't know. We certainly hope it's going to succeed, and we do our diligence to hopefully check on that. But we'll have a lot more data 7 years later when we see what he or she was actually capable of and what they did. Again, subject to some forces that are totally outside of their control.
Right. So, what I was moving towards was this idea that what you're describing in terms of Point, and particularly in Peer Street, is this migration to crowdsourced equity as a business model. But the foundation for it is still institutional capital. So my question to you is, do you think that in the future you're going to see the institutions disintermediated from that process? And the reason that I ask that is it seems like with Peer Street and with Point, you have the perfect opportunity to marry these two generation of people after this last downturn that simply can't afford to buy a home for whatever reason. But they do have money to put down on a home, right? But they can't afford a home that they want. They don't have enough, and they don't have the credit or whatever it happens to be. Prices are too high. So they're being crammed out of the market, right? They want to invest in real estate. They want to be exposed to the market, but they can't buy a home. So it's that population, that constituency, which is, colossal in the tens of millions in the United States at the moment who can't buy homes. They, it seems to me, would make perfect clients to invest in somebody else's down payment, get some of that upside, in fact, a proportional share of that upside. Even though I can't buy my own house, at least I'm in the real estate game, right? I've got a share of a house over there, or maybe of 5 houses. So do you think that's something that in due time you will see happening?
Well, I certainly hope so. I mean, even if, to your point, it makes sense. Diversification has always made a lot of sense because I think there are two forces at play here. One, the way that our economy was saved from the brink, and this has happened a number of times. Like, you have, fiscal and monetary policy, which are the two arms of kind of government control. So the government can either kind of spend money and build roads and bridges and tunnels and everything that the government has done historically to try to pump up the economy and be a large consumer. And the other thing that the government can do is monetary policy, where they can lower interest rates or kind of effectively print lots of money, buy lots of bonds and that way like distribute more money into the economy. The problem is that money is not equally distributed. Like, there's something called universal basic income, which is an argument that some people are saying that we should give people money, just kind of like helicopter money, because if everybody has more money, then good things happen. Well, right now we already have universal basic income, but for people that own assets. Like, that's what quantitative easing was. It was a form of universal basic income, and it's the wrong term, but it was a form of that for effectively wealthy people that owned assets. If you did not own assets, then you got left behind. So there's a very, very strong argument for if everybody owned a home, or if everybody had some kind of actual asset. It could be stock in a stock market, it could be a home, but actually, like, a huge number of Americans, they don't have a single share of stock, they don't own a home, like they're paycheck to paycheck, and this kind of boom of the last 10 years completely bypassed them, or not really the last 10 years, but the recovery from 2009 until now completely bypassed them, because a lot of the recovery was fueled by monetary policy that really just inflated asset prices. There are numerous reasons why it's a good idea, but that was kind of only part of it. What I was saying in very, very strong agreement with what you were talking about, which is, like, the reason why you get insurance is because pools, it's often a very good idea to participate in any sort of pool. It makes sense for if you are a healthy person and you go partner with 10 other healthy people and you say, let's go get our own form of health insurance together. That makes sense because, any one problem might bankrupt any of you, but like having that pool means that you're actually much more secure. And the same thing goes, even though I was not joking about Detroit, but Detroit had a very strong, and actually continued to have a strong economic and real estate downturn. It would make sense for people in Detroit to say, okay, well, I own 100% of my house in Detroit right now. Maybe I should diversify. Actually being part of a larger pool, if it's done correctly, is not just subject to adverse selection. I own 100% of my house in Detroit right now. Maybe I should diversify. Actually being part of a larger pool, if it's done correctly, is not just subject to adverse selection and moral hazard. It actually benefits all parties involved, because you don't know ex ante if you are in the soon to decrease pool or the soon to increase pool. But I think it makes lots of sense, both from a more people participate in appreciation of assets perspective and a diversification perspective for, like, I would love to, not own 100% of my home. That last 10%, I can go allocate that to 1,000 other homes in tiny, tiny slices. But the first part of that is actually providing, like, doing that subdivision, doing that valuation process, like just treating the entire residential real estate market, and for that matter, the commercial real estate market, as effectively a stock market. Like, there are many, many benefits to saying, like, all right, we have all these public companies. It'd be bad for most of the public, because the public doesn't have a way of participating in the appreciation of those assets, of the dividends that are generated from those. It actually makes a lot more sense to subdivide and allow a marketplace to develop. And that has been very, very hard to do in the residential space. And, I think it's very exciting.
Well, it's in the commercial space as well, isn't it, Alex? That's the transformational change that the Jobs Act has brought to real estate. You see it with Pier Street and, others in the same space.
Yeah, but I would say that for rental stock in general, like, I believe there are 1,500 REITs in the United States. And, REITs, in order to be a REIT, I think 75% of your gross income has to be in, rental of, it has to, I think 90% has to be distributed. Like, it's a very narrowly defined. Your gross income has to be in, rental of, it has to, I think 90% has to be distributed. Like, it's a very narrowly defined kind of corporate structure. But you already have, and many of them are publicly traded, you have trillions of dollars of kind of assets managed by REITs worldwide. So you already have this notion, but almost by and large, these are designed for rental income. So you buy an asset, you manage the asset, you collect rent on that, and then you distribute it. That's what a REIT is. You don't really have that for kind of owner-occupied stock. And that's what is a little, like, there's no REIT, like, of, all right, here are all of the homes in Palo Alto. That just, it could make sense, but you could have that for rental, but you can't really have that for owner-occupied. So, like, that's what I define as the opportunity. And it's much more common in the commercial space, where, like, you have a variety of kind of you have a variety of commercial REITs that do this, but they're all about income.
All right. So what do you see are the key challenges today and in the short term for both of these portfolio companies, Point and Peer Street? What are their challenges, do you think, to the near-term future?
Sure. Well, I think for they're very different, because Peer Street is about people that buy old properties, fix them up, and then sell them typically within a short-term time horizon. Mm-hmm. So for Peer Street, I mean, to a certain extent, it is speculative. I mean, I would argue in many cases in supply-constrained markets with kind of low loan-to-value ratios, it's not that speculative of an investment. And like of all the loans that they've done, like not a single one has lost money. So that's a good sign. Although, again, past performance is no indicator of future success. Peer Street is
especially
very,
in the last few years. Yeah.
No, especially in the last few years. But again, like if you were to bet on, I mean, as long as you could guarantee, like if you have title to something that you continue owning that thing, and that's why, like if you were to look at a multi-thousand-year time horizon where countries routinely disappear, it's a little bit complicated. But I would rather own real estate than anything else. Like companies, they come and go. Precious metals, sometimes they're precious, sometimes they're not. Paintings, taste change, but like place on ground, like that has performed very, very well. Again, assuming that you have the government has not shifted under your feet, in which case the title becomes a little bit complicated to maintain. So I think it's a very, very good source of value and source of wealth, and it certainly has been over countless generations. So Peer Street, I think their main challenge is they're actually a very unique model, which is they don't try to compete with all of the local lenders that already do this across the country. So there already are thousands of people. There already are thousands of people, entities, and funds that say, I'm going to fund economic development in my city or my municipality. I have a $10 million fund, and that means that I loan to all these local real estate developers that I know. They pay me back, and then once they pay me back, I can make loans again. Now, the problem is that they can't really scale their model like these local real estate developers. They could scale much more quickly if they could go sell part of the loans that they're originating to a third party, and that's what Peer Street does. So I might be a local developer in Jacksonville. I go get what's called a hard money loan from my friend who knows me and knows that all my projects are finished on time, and that I'm very responsible and I know how to manage my GC and all these kinds of things. And then that Jacksonville-based lender will then sell maybe 90% of the loan to Peer Street, who then syndicates it to a bunch of accredited and/or institutional investors. And then that allows that local Jacksonville developer to go make another loan, or maybe they need their capital back sooner because it's not a professional entity. So that's how Peer Street operates, which is. So they grow or shrink, although they've been growing. They've never been shrinking. They're just growing based on finding more of these local real estate lenders and working with them. And also, it's very important for them to avoid adverse selection. So they actually do their own underwriting on top of the underwriting that the local lender has done, because what they wouldn't want to have happen is have a lender come on the platform and say, these 3 loans, I don't trust those guys. They're probably never going to pay me back. Let me go sell those to Peer Street. So they don't want that. They don't do that. They do their underwriting. But, they've scaled over $500 million of loans, with no defaults over the last, have this kind of distributed knowledge base. It turns out that the person who's on the ground in Jacksonville, who's lived there for 30 years, that knows that this block is good, that block is bad, this developer is good, that developer is bad, that's actually very useful. And it's kind of interesting, it's a little bit of it's not a Luddite fantasy here. It's more of sometimes a centralized platform loses knowledge that's trapped in humans' heads. And they're kind of the opposite, which is they say, hey, there's lots of positive knowledge that's trapped in humans' heads. Let's use that. And by the way, we end up not buying lots of Google ads, because that's actually the big challenge with fintech writ large. Is the problem is, somebody like Geico spends $1 billion a year on advertising, or a little bit more, $1.2 billion a year in the U.S. alone on advertising. So if you and I say, hey, we can do something better than Geico, well, where are we going to get our customers from? Who's going to give us $1.2 billion to go advertise? Your average venture firm might be. If you and I say, hey, we can we could do something better than Geico. Well, where are we going to get our customers from? Who's going to give us $1.2 billion to go advertise? Like your average venture firm might give $7 to $10 million as an initial investment. So it's very, very hard to get the customers. And the cool thing about Peer Street is that they don't have to spend any money getting the end customers. In other words, they don't have to spend any money getting those end developers. They have a sales team that goes out and at one point, or like kind of one time only, goes and acquires that real estate lender. And then that lender then originates lots and lots of downstream borrowers. So, that's why I like their model. It just wasn't a way to transfer money to Google, which is what most fintech companies are.
Right, and then you've also got this multiplier effect, right? You go out and you lend to a lender, and they're the ones doing the local homework. And it actually strikes me that, all the people that are investing in peer prospects for investing in points as well, right? Because they're likely to have, from a diversification perspective, to be taking a piece in equity in an up market. You have to make the same assumption about the real estate, the residential real estate market on both platforms. You have to be assuming that the market is at worst stable and at best still in an upward trajectory.
It's actually about to say this. Like the main difference between the two is just it's the duration and the fact that a lot of work input goes into the output with Peer Street, because the idea for Peer Street it's not here's a vacant piece of land, I need money to hold it for 9 months, so I'll find a greater fool to pay more for it in 9 months. It's here is an old dilapidated house, I'm going to fix it up, and there are lots of potential homeowners that don't want to buy a dilapidated house, that want to buy a functional house. And it's that improvement that actually yields the value. But the problem is that you need input of capital to yield that output of improvement that yields that output of value. And that's where Peer Street comes in. Whereas Point, in most cases, actually for Point right now, it's not a down payment product, just because the banks ultimately have to recognize the fact that it is a down payment. It's a complicated thing. They will eventually. Right now,
they're not allowed to currently.
That's right. It's complicated. Like if you go get a mortgage and you have money that mysteriously appeared in your house appeared in your bank account to go make the down payment, the bank will interrogate you like, is this a gift? If it's a gift, it's fine. If it's a loan, then that actually means that you didn't have the money to make the down payment, and therefore you're not a conforming mortgage anymore.
Yeah. So, and even if it's a gift, it has to come from mom and pop or whoever it is, someone very close.
It's pretty complicated, but yes, but having talked to you guys at Freddie and Fannie, like this is the mandate though, which is like the whole reason why these are government sponsored entities is they want to encourage home ownership, and like they are very, very supportive of this notion of if you make it easier for somebody to make a down payment without necessarily indicating that they're not able to own the home, right? Like which is what a gift disguised as a loan, or rather a loan disguised as a gift might be. Because if you have to repay it in 1 year, like what's the point? But if it actually is a way of like lowering monthly payments and making home ownership more accessible, then that's a universal good that, our government wants to encourage. But anyway, what I was saying with Point is that it's a much longer duration product, and the people, as opposed to Peer Street. So the people that use Point right now, the use case is actually a little bit, it's different than the down payment one, just because you have a lot of people that have bad credit, and the reason why they have bad credit is because their debt to income ratio is too high. And why is that too high? Well, they have too much debt relative to their income. So the way that they get that down, they either lower their debt or they increase their income. So, but what's interesting is that if you have somebody that owns 50% of their house, so they have 50% loan to value on the home, they have very, very bad credit. They can't even get a credit card. But you know what's interesting is that I would, what's the risk if it's a nice house in Palo Alto and the person has a 620 FICO? And the reason why they have a 620 FICO is because they have too much debt relative to their income. Like you're really not underwriting the person, you're underwriting the property. And you want to look at what are the characteristics of this property? Would you want to invest in this property over a 10-year time horizon? That's kind of the main question. And then from the consumer perspective, what's really interesting is that these people that have they have bad credit, but it's almost like the way to miraculously get rid of it is to sell part of the equity in their home, use that instantaneously to pay off their other debts. And now their debt goes down. Their debt to income goes also down because their income has stayed flat and their debt has gone down. And now they have a 720 FICO. And they are now they can participate in the financial system again. This actually hurt a lot of people in 07 to 09 that got over their skis and, might have even gone bankrupt. That means they have a 10-year black mark on their credit history.
Right.
They can't get a HELOC. They can't get anything. But again, you're not actually, it doesn't matter about the credit history of the consumer, provided that you're looking at a secured asset or a secured loan, which is what Point is. I mean, it actually is equity, and that Point can lose money if the value of the home decreases, but it is a secured form of equity because it's backed by the home. It's backed by a lien on the property.
Now, is there anything that Andreessen Horowitz, any kind of day-to-day management support that you provide to your portfolio companies? Do you bring added value in addition to the capital that you bring, or are you very much hands-off?
Oh no, we're a lot different than other firms. So there are kind of two philosophies of venture capital, I would say. The old way was there might be 5 or 6 people at a venture capital firm, very, very small, and they would get involved and be on the board, but the main value add, if you will, was the capital. And at our firm, I'm one of, I think, 9 general partners here. And we're the ones that make the investments, but we probably have 120 other people that work at the firm, and they try to help with all sorts of other things. So we have a recruiting function. So we probably have 15 people that work in recruiting because it's very hard to hire engineers, to hire executive talent. So we help with that. We have a whole other function that focuses on policy. And regulatory affairs because, we're a big investor in Airbnb. And we're also a big investor in Lyft. So Lyft and Airbnb, their clients are different than the people that often try to cause trouble for them in terms of, I wouldn't say cause trouble for them, but again, going back to a lot of industries are kind of the old guard tries to prevent the new guard and the new companies from coming in, and that certainly, you've probably read about the hotel industry not liking what Airbnb is doing or the taxi industry not liking what Lyft is doing. Sometimes not liking goes a little bit stronger in that they will lobby local and even federal or state governments to try to pass laws to make these new tech-enabled businesses that consumers like and that benefit consumers. They try to prevent them from existing. So our policy and regulatory affairs team helps companies that are dealing with such situations deal with that. And we have another team on marketing. Actually, so Katie is my partner on communications and marketing. So, I just invested in a company called Active Hours, and they're trying to figure out what's the best story that they can tell. We just did a big press release, and that's where, Katie and her team really helped participate on that. So we have lots of different distinct verticals that we try to help our portfolio companies in. And one is also fundraising that we call development teams. So, that's everything from, actually, it's kind of a new function for many of the fintech companies because, as I mentioned, our fundraising efforts for our companies are typically for their next round of capital on the equity side. But every single one of our fintech companies actually needs debt capital or they need lending capital, which is a little bit different. So it's something that we've been beefing up a bit.
And do you help them source accredited investors? As well through your own networks?
We don't right now. Again, this is something that it's becoming evident that is necessary on the fintech side. In some cases, it's one of the same. If you look at who our limited partners are, the people that invested in our own funds, in some cases, they want exposure to credit instruments, and we'll just introduce them. So, many of our LPs are nonprofits and endowments, and they'll say, I want 5% of my portfolio in venture capital, I want 20% in U.S. equities, I want 15% in foreign equities, and I want 7.2% in credit instruments. In many cases, they will select their own managers to go do that, as opposed to write their own checks. So, but we know who those managers are, and sometimes we'll introduce them if we think it might be a fit. So, Peer Street, if you want a short term, kind of most of their assets are originating, and we'll certainly make introductions. introductions, 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 introductions,
All of my guests are masters of their field, and so by way of discovering if there are consistent themes among them for how they achieve their excellence, I have started asking 3 questions. What are their key daily habits, their hardest lesson learned, and advice to someone considering investing in real estate? What are your answers to these questions? Here are Alex's.
What are the key daily habits that you have to make you and your business successful?
Key daily habits. Well, I'm injured right now, but it used to always be going for a run at night because I would have infinite energy when that was done, and I'd be able to get through all my email for the day. But I think it's just having a very well manicured to-do list is probably the thing that I'm up to now since I'm currently injured.
Very good. Number 2, what has been the hardest lesson that you have learned? Well, because this is a real estate podcast, I want to say in real estate, but if you don't have one in real estate, a hard lesson in real estate, in business, what's been the hardest lesson you've learned?
The deal's not done until the money's in the bank.
Absolute truth to that. And number 3, if you could give one piece of advice to somebody who has not yet invested in real estate, thinking about Peer Street perhaps, as they go out looking for investors, but is considering investing, what would that advice be?
So I think I would say if there's a room of people and you don't know who the sucker is, then you're the sucker. So just making sure that you understand, like, why is this opportunity available to you and you alone? Or, if you're developing something on your own, the corollary to that is there some unique value that you can bring? Because in many cases, like, unique investment opportunities often mean that there's a sucker. Opportunities often mean that there's a sucker. Like, they often mean that you're the sucker, so you have to have some way of making sure that you're entering this market at the right time and or you're bringing the right value to make sure that that's not you.
Alex thinks of real estate as being an industry that is due for an upgrade, and that tremendous wealth can be built by investing in the companies that bring about the inevitable changes. He sees that real estate, as the world's largest asset class, is totally dependent on finance, and that the time is ripe for technology to be disruptive in the changes it brings. A fintech opportunity whereby identifying inefficiencies in the status quo that can be resolved through applying tech solutions, vast scale can result, because the usual way we finance our deals and invest in them can be completely reshaped. Consequently, by investing in marketplace platforms such as Peer Street and Point, not investing in the real estate itself, which is really better left to mortals like us, but by investing we the real estate community interacts with each other, Alex is looking to capture thousands of times his equity investment. Take a look at the show notes for today's episode, where I have included links to all the companies Alex talked about, as well as some bonus links I uncovered in researching his background and the way he sees the world. You can find them at the nationalrealestateforum.org website, nreforum.org/Alex. In the next episode, after Thanksgiving, I'm going to be talking to Eve Picker, founder and CEO of the Small Change website. Small Change is the only online marketplace where you can conduct both a Reg D offering and a Reg CF offering at the same time. This matters because it means that as an issuer, you can offer your deal to everybody relatively inexpensively without limitation to their income or net worth. Last thing, remember to take a look at the forum.org/primer and use the coupon code ARIEL, ARIEL, for a 30% discount. In it, I provide a roadmap for how to finance and invest in real estate, as well as some insights that I usually share only with clients. Thanks again for tuning in today, and thank you also to Alex Rampell, General Partner at Andreessen Horowitz, for sharing your time with me today. Until next time, this is Dr. Adam Gower signing off.